Hey there, young historians. We are back for a Nation Divided Part 2, where we're seeing all of the events that led up to the United States splitting into two parts, a North and a South. Here we go. Last time we met, we saw that California wanted to become a United States state. This is what the scale looked like at the time: 15 free states in the North, 15 slave states in the South. California now wants to enter the United States as a free state, and we saw that Congress was deadlocked in this issue again, where they didn't know if California should be a free or slave state. So this is what Congress looks like, and right here in the center we've got Henry Clay. Henry Clay is considered the great compromiser. Remember me? Henry Clay's the name. Compromise is my game, brah. You know, he was the same one that came up with the idea for the Missouri Compromise, saving the United States from that crisis when Missouri wanted to enter as a slave state. Now we've got him back trying to decide what to do with California. You see he's got the S on his chest, well now it's on his back, on his cape there. Well, here's the thing, Henry Clay's kind of a controversial figure, because of course he's from the North, and he wants to figure out some solution here, but actually he was a slave owner himself. So, somebody else says, yes, we know all about your compromising, perhaps compromising your values. He's actually the bizarro Superman there. All right, so this is what the Compromise of 1850 looked like. Henry Clay was mainly responsible for that. And on one shoulder, he's got free your slaves. On the other shoulder, he's got, but you need them. See, he was, like I said, he was a controversial figure. Well, these are the parts of the compromise they came up with for what to do with California. Well, they were going to make California a free state. You can see on the scale there, 16 to 15 now. But in return, what do the southern states get? They get New Mexico and the Utah territories to decide for themselves. Yes, this is what the map would look like. California, you can see here, is a free state, but the Utah territory and the New Mexico territory, they're going to get to decide on slavery for themselves once they become states. That means the people in those states would get to vote in what's called popular sovereignty. Third part of this compromise, the slave trade would be outlawed in Washington, D.C. Crazy to think, but all the way up until this point, Washington, D.C. still allowed human trafficking. They allowed for humans to be purchased and sold in the nation's capital. It's pretty unbelievable that even up until 1850 that was still happening. Well, the fourth part is the fugitive slave law. And this allowed Southerners to go up into the North, find their escaped enslaved people, capture them, and bring them back into slavery. In other words, there was no place in the United States that was safe from escaped slaves. Yeah. So the fugitive slave law in 1850 said that it required these slave catchers to look for escaped slaves, escaped enslaved people in the North. And you can even see there was rewards being offered in the North so that other people would become slave catchers themselves. See, the Northerners hated this because they didn't want to become slave catchers. They didn't want to be participating in slavery at all. And the Southerners actually hated it because it turns out that the fugitive slave law just was not that effective. Maybe about 150 people were actually captured and brought back into slavery. Okay, so that is the Compromise of 1850. And that's what the map then looks like at the end of that. And here's what the entire map looks like after that compromise was created. All right, a bit of vocabulary here. We need to know what this word abolitionist means. An abolitionist is a person who wants slavery to end, who will do what it takes and do what is necessary to try to end slavery. You're seeing 5 images there of different abolitionists during the time. We've met Frederick Douglass before. We're going to meet we've met William Lloyd Garrison as well. We're going to meet John Brown soon. And let's go over to Harriet Beecher Stowe next. Harriet Beecher Stowe was a woman from the North, and she was a novelist, an author. And she wrote a novel called Uncle Tom's Cabin. And in this novel, she wrote about how terrible slavery was, the evils of slavery. She wrote about a poor man who was attacked by his slave owner and was beaten to death. She tells other examples of heroic escapes and just shows how evil slavery is. Well, the story blows up. It becomes the best-selling novel of the entire 1800s. It sells millions of copies in the North, and Northerners now learn of the evils of slavery. They had heard of it before, but they didn't really understand it if they'd never been down to the South. All right, so Uncle Tom's Cabin, a hugely influential book and novel. All right, the Kansas-Nebraska Act is now another law that is created in 1854. And you see here the Nebraska Territory and the Kansas Territory, they were trying to decide if they would allow slavery or not. Well, the law said that the Nebraska and Kansas territories would be able to decide on slavery by popular sovereignty. In other words, the people that live there can decide whether they want slavery or not. If you have more people in Kansas that want slavery and they vote for it, it would be a slave state. If there was more people that wanted to be free, it'd be a free state, all right? So you have Northerners and Southerners. We have anti-slavery and pro-slavery people rushing into Kansas at the same time, and it creates conflict. Kansas becomes known as Bleeding Kansas. We talked about that sea of blood. Well, the sea of blood begins here in Kansas. Lots of violence, lots of bloodshed between anti-slavery, they're against it, and pro-slavery, they're for it. This is an image from Lawrence, Kansas in 1856. All right, one man from this whole event is named John Brown. We just saw him. He's a fierce abolitionist. And he's also growing out that beard for as we get closer and closer to the Civil War here, right? So John Brown was a fierce abolitionist. And at one time, he was in Lawrence, Kansas with his sons, and they went and attacked some pro-slavery people, some people that really wanted slavery. They dragged them out of their houses and hacked them to death with swords. Yeah, John Brown was not messing around. He hacked people to death. All right, we'll see more on John Brown in a moment. Let's go over to an event that you probably heard about in Minnesota history. It's the Dred Scott decision, a Supreme Court case in 1857. This man is Dred Scott. He was an enslaved man from Missouri, and he traveled into the north, into the Wisconsin territory, which is also part of Minnesota, and visited with his slave owner. Well, when he got back to Missouri, he said, "Hey, I spent time in a free state. That makes me a free man." And his slave owner's like, "Yeah, right." And he's like, "Actually, it really does, and I'm going to take you to court and sue you over it so that I can get my freedom." Well, if the slavery was illegal there and he was a free man, that's what his argument was. So this ends up going all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And the United States Supreme Court makes one of its worst rulings or decisions that I can ever think of. In a 5-4 decision, they said that Dred Scott, you can't even sue for your freedom because you're not a citizen. And furthermore, no African American, enslaved or free, will ever become a citizen. Clearly that's not true. Clearly that's no longer a decision that is upheld by the courts, but that is what they decided at the time and did hold true for a while. This, of course, upset abolitionists. They're furious about it, and the issue of slavery and citizenship arises again. This is what the United States looks like in 1857. You can see all of the light purple here. That is territory that is now open to slavery, meaning there's the possibility that slavery could exist there if the people there want it to exist. All right, John Brown, remember that fierce abolitionist I talked about with the big white beard? He's back, and he's got a plan this time. He and his sons and a few others, they're going to attack the federal arsenal. This is a place where the military holds weapons, stores them. It's called Harper's Ferry in Virginia. Virginia is a slave state. And so he and these men are going to attack the federal arsenal, gather up as many weapons as they can, and their goal is to hand them over to enslaved people so the enslaved people can kill their slave owners and escape to freedom. Now, it's violent, but hey, desperate times call for desperate measures, right? So he does a pretty desperate thing here. The problem is, it wasn't very well planned out because once they get into the federal arsenal, those enslaved people do not arrive because they're enslaved, right? So they don't arrive to get those weapons, and he becomes trapped. And John Brown and his sons are caught. They are found guilty of treason, and they are hanged, put to death. Well, John Brown becomes sort of a martyr. It means somebody who dies for their beliefs. You can see here, this image shows how a lot of Northerners saw him sort of as like almost a godlike figure, right? All right, one more event here. The Lincoln-Douglas debates. I talked about this actually already before. Here's Abraham Lincoln. And behind him standing here, this is Stephen Douglas. And these two men want to be the next United States Senator from Illinois. Okay? And they decided to set up a series of debates. I believe there are 6 of them. And in these debates, they're going to talk about the issue of slavery. Now, Illinois is a free state, okay? But Stephen Douglas and Abraham Lincoln are going to discuss the issue of slavery. And one argument that Stephen Douglas makes is that the Dred Scott decision in the Supreme Court, it solved the issue of slavery. Basically, slavery is legal. and slaves are property. They would never be able to be citizens. They never have been. They never will be. And Lincoln says, I've heard all of that. I've heard of the laws and the decisions made by the Supreme Court. But slavery is not a legal issue. It is a moral issue. It is the difference between right and wrong. And slavery is wrong. Now, these debates are covered heavily by the newspapers, and they travel across the country, and Americans hear about this, and it really makes them grapple with the decision of whether slavery is right or wrong. In the end, the result of this, Lincoln does not win, okay? He lost this election. Stephen Douglas becomes the next U.S. Senator from Illinois. But Lincoln gained something that was probably more valuable. He gained national attention. The rest of the country now knew his name, they knew what he looked like, and they knew what he stood for. And his arguments make people think about the morality of slavery. Now, as you know, Abraham Lincoln is going to become the President of the United States eventually, actually much closer than you might even think. Even though he doesn't win that Senate seat, he's going to become the president pretty quickly as well. And because of his national attention, and because of his stances on morality, just being a good person, he gains a lot of national attention. All right? This is the final event that we're going to see right now as America is torn apart into two, the North and the South. We are now leading up to the very final event that leads to the North and the South secession, civil war, and a sea of blood. Okay, that's it. I'll see you next time for the beginnings of the Civil War. See ya.